Hello, fifth graders, and welcome to Language Arts for today. For today, nothing unusual. You will need your copy of Little Women, and perhaps we'll want some paper and a pencil in order to be writing down as we go. So for today, fifth graders, we're going to be again working on identifying theme evidence. Hopefully, this is one that is familiar to you. We've done it quite a few times throughout the reading of Little Women. So as a reminder, these are our three themes that we're going to be looking at. Okay, I'm trying to get it without a glare, but it's not working so great. Okay, societal expectations of women, the importance of living a virtuous life, or the relationship between money and happiness. And again, here, this question being, what is that relationship, or is there a relationship between money and happiness? So we're going to go in and take a look at our questions for today, and then we're going to get right into our reading. Flip you around. Here we go. So number one, how did Joe and Lori surprise Beth? 2, what special gift did Meg receive? 3, what surprise did Lori bring to the Marches? 4, what did Mr. March tell the girls that they had succeeded in? So your answer, you're going to have to say, Mr. March told the girls that they had succeeded in blank. And then this is going to require some degree of inferring. It's not going to be something that he comes out directly to say. So you have to think about, what is he talking to the girls about as he goes through? And I'll be talking about it as we get to that question as well. 5, to which theme might this relate, right? We'd say this might relate to the theme blank. 6, what did the Marches think that they might never hear again? And then 7, we're creating a sentence following all vocabulary sentence expectations using this word estimable. Remember, with our vocabulary sentences, those sentences need to be at least 6 words long, and they need to capture the definition of the word by using it appropriately in context, okay? So with that in mind, we're going to get right into today's reading. So following along with me in chapter 22, which is on page 213. Chapter 22 is titled Pleasant Meadows. Like sunshine after storm were the peaceful weeks which followed. The invalids improved rapidly, and Mr. March began to talk of returning early in the new year. Beth was soon able to lie on the study sofa all day, amusing herself with the well-beloved cats at first, and in time with Doll's sewing, which had fallen sadly behindhand. Her once active limbs were so stiff and feeble that Joe took her a daily airing around the house in her strong arms. Meg cheerfully blackened and burned her white hands, cooking delicate messes for the dear, while Amy, a loyal slave of the ring, celebrated her return by giving away as many of her treasures as she could prevail on her sisters to accept. So we remember Meg at the beginning of the story, we talked about, the narrator tells us about how she was very vain about her beautiful hands. And so now we see that she's kind of sacrificing that vanity in order to cook meals for Beth. As Christmas approached, the usual mysteries began to haunt the house, and Joe frequently convulsed the family by proposing utterly impossible or magnificently absurd ceremonies in honor of this unusually merry Christmas. Laurie was equally impracticable and would have had bonfires, skyrockets, and triumphal arches if he had had his own way. After many skirmishes and snubbings, the ambitious pair were considered effectually quenched and went about with forlorn faces, which were rather belied by explosions of laughter when the two got together. So Joe and Laurie seem to be kind of scheming surprises in order to celebrate the holiday season. Several days of unusually mild weather fitly ushered in a splendid Christmas day. Hannah felt in her bones that it was going to be an unusually fine day, and she proved herself a true prophetess, for everybody and everything seemed bound to produce a grand success. To begin with, Mr. March wrote that he should soon be with them. Then Beth felt uncommonly well that morning, and being dressed in her mother's gift, a soft crimson merino wrapper, so she's wrapped in a shawl, was borne in triumph to the window to behold the offering of Joe and Laurie. So we're about to hear that answer to question 1. The unquenchables, Joe and Laurie, had done their best to be worthy of the name, for like elves, they had worked by night and conjured up a comical surprise. Out in the garden stood a stately snow maiden, crowned with holly, bearing a basket of fruit and flowers in one hand, a great roll of new music in the other, a perfect rainbow of an afghan round her chilly shoulders, and a Christmas carol issuing from her lips on a pink paper streamer. So a snow maiden, right? Maiden being female, so they built a female snow person, and then there were some gifts tucked in there as well. There's a kind of a wreath crown here. She's holding fruit and flowers in a basket. There's some new piano music. There's a shawl wrapped around her, and then a carol issuing from her mouth. So there's been something written on a piece of paper on a streamer that's coming out of her mouth. So it's a snow maiden, and then there's also a lot of other surprises for Beth in there too. The Jungfrau, which means maiden in German, to Beth. God bless you, dear Queen Bess. May nothing you dismay. Some of you, if you know the God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen song, kind of sounds like that. So, God bless ye, dear Queen Bess. May nothing you dismay, but health and peace and happiness be yours this Christmas day. Here's fruit to feed our busy bee and flowers for her nose. Here's music. It doesn't go quite the same here. Here's music for her peony, an afghan for her toes. So you can kind of imagine her singing this. A portrait of Joanna C. by Raphael #2, who labored with great industry to make it fair and true. Accept a ribbon red, I beg, for Madame Purrer's tail, and ice cream made by lovely Peg, a Mont Blanc in a pail. So in addition, it seems like there's other gifts, right? Amy drew her picture, Meg made her a dessert. Their dearest love my makers laid within my breast of snow. Accept it, and the Alpine maid from Laurie and from Joe. Okay, so we see our answer to number 1. How Beth laughed when she saw it. How Laurie ran up and down to bring in the gifts, and what ridiculous speeches Joe made as she presented them. I'm so full of happiness that if Father was only here, I couldn't hold one drop more, said Beth, quite sighing with contentment, as Joe carried her off to the study to rest after the excitement, and to refresh herself with some of the delicious grapes the Jungfrau had sent her. So am I, added Joe, slapping the pocket wherein reposed the long-desired Undine and Sintram. So remember, that's the book that Joe had wanted last Christmas, and so now she has it. I'm sure I am, echoed Amy, poring over the engraved copy of the Madonna and Child, which her mother had given her in a pretty frame. Of course I am, cried Meg, smoothing the silvery folds of her first silk dress, for Mr. Lawrence had insisted on giving it. So that's our answer to question 2. And remember, this is something that Meg has been sighing about and longing for throughout the book. And so we see that she finally has this wish of hers fulfilled from Mr. Lawrence. How can I be otherwise, said Mrs. March gratefully, as her eyes went from her husband's letter to Beth's smiling face, and her hand caressed the brooch made of gray and golden, chestnut and dark brown hair, which the girls had fastened on her breast. Now and then in this workaday world, things do happen in the delightful storybook fashion, and what a comfort that is. Half an hour after everyone had said they were so happy they could only hold one drop more, the drop came. Laurie opened the parlor door and popped his head in very quietly. He might just as well have turned a somersault and uttered a war whoop, for his face was so full of suppressed excitement and his voice so treacherously joyful that everyone jumped up, though he only said in a queer, breathless voice, here's another Christmas present for the March family. So this is question 3. Before the words were well out of his mouth, he was whisked away somehow, and in his place appeared a tall man, muffled up to the eyes, leaning on the arm of another tall man, who tried to say something and couldn't. Of course, there was a general stampede, and for several minutes everybody seemed to lose their wits, for the strangest things were done, and no one said a word. Who predicts, who knows what the surprise is, this tall man? Mr. March became invisible in the embrace of 4 pairs of loving arms. Jo disgraced herself by nearly fainting away, and had to be doctored by Laurie in the china closet. Mr. Brooke kissed Meg entirely by mistake, as he somewhat incoherently explained, and Amy, the dignified, tumbled over a stool and, never stopping to get up, hugged and cried over her father's boots in the most touching manner. Mrs. March was the first to recover herself and held up her hand with a warning. Hush, remember Beth. So their father comes through the door, and we're kind of assuming that the other tall character is Mr. Brooke, and everyone's so excited, and there's all kinds of reactions, right? Joe's fainting, and Amy's tripping in order to get over there, and she's crying, and Mr. Brooke, in his excitement, plants a kiss on Meg, and so there's all this kind of shock and chaos, and now Mrs. March is saying, guys, remember, Beth is resting in the other room. But it was too late. The study door flew open. The little red wrapper appeared on the threshold. Joy put strength into the feeble limbs, and Beth ran straight into her father's arms. Never mind what happened just after that, for the full hearts overflowed, washing away the bitterness of the past and leaving only the sweetness of the present. It was not at all romantic, but a hearty laugh set everybody straight again, for Hannah was discovered behind the door sobbing over the fat turkey, which she had forgotten to put down when she rushed up from the kitchen. As the laugh subsided, Mrs. March began to thank Mr. Brooke for his faithful care of her husband, at which Mr. Brooke suddenly remembered that Mr. March needed rest, and seizing Laurie, he precipitately retired. Then the two invalids, so that's Beth and Mr. March, were ordered to repose, which they did by both sitting in one big chair and talking hard. Mr. March told how he had longed to surprise them, and how, when the fine weather came, he had been allowed by his doctor to take advantage of it. How devoted Brooke had been, and how he was altogether a most estimable and upright young man. So he's describing Mr. Brooke as estimable, our vocabulary word. Why Mr. March paused a minute just there, and after a glance at Meg, who was violently poking the fire, looked at his wife with an inquiring lift of the eyebrows, I leave you to imagine. Also, why Mrs. March gently nodded her head and asked rather abruptly if he wouldn't have something to eat. Joe saw and understood the look, and she stalked grimly away to get wine and beef tea, muttering to herself as she slammed the door, I hate estimable young men with brown eyes. Okay, so we see this sort of like communication between Mrs. March and Mr. March, right? Mr. March mentions how estimable, right, Mr. Brooke is. He says he's been so great, he's been so helpful, I hold him in high regard. And then he pauses and looks over at Meg, kind of with curiosity. And what is Meg doing over there? She suddenly seems to be very interested in the fire. It is kind of poking it vigorously, almost as if she is trying to like hide her face or act like she's uninterested in this topic. So she's kind of trying to avoid this conversation. Mr. March is observing her with this look of like, I mentioned Mr. Brooke, what is your reaction? And her reaction is to kind of hide her face and focus on the fire. So you can kind of infer that maybe there's some blushing happening, or she's trying to behave uninterestedly. Then he looks at his wife with an inquiring look of the eyebrows, meaning he kind of asks her a question like, what have you learned, with his inquiring eyebrows? And she nods her head in response. So what do we think he's asking? As he mentions Mr. Brooke and then looks at Meg, who's hiding her face. So he looks at his wife and sort of asks her with his eyebrows a question, which she nods in response to. So what do you infer he's probably asking her? What do you infer? I feel like a strong inference here is he's asking, does she love Mr. Brooke? And Mrs. March says, she nods and says yes, right? So there's this communication that's happening without words. And again, we can kind of infer what that conversation is. And we get this confirmation because Joe sees the whole exchange and she stomps out of the room and says, I hate estimable young men with brown eyes. And we know Mr. Brooke has brown eyes. That's come up repeatedly. Okay, and we also know Mr. March just called him estimable. So Joe's kind of reusing that word that Mr. March used. There never was such a Christmas dinner as they had that day. The fat turkey was a sight to behold when Hannah sent him up stuffed, browned, and decorated. So was the plum pudding, which quite melted in one's mouth. Likewise the jellies, in which Amy reveled like a fly in a honey pot. Everything turned out well, which was a mercy, Hannah said, for my mind was that flustered, Mum, that it's a miracle I didn't roast the pudding and stuff the turkey with raisins, let alone biling of it in a cloth. So she's saying she likely would have made mistakes with the cooking. Mr. Lawrence and his grandson dined with them, also Mr. Brooke, at whom Joe glowered darkly, to Laurie's infinite amusement. Two easy chairs stood side by side at the head of the table, in which sat Beth and her father, feasting modestly on chicken and a little fruit. They drank healths, told stories, sang songs, reminisced, as the old folks say, and had a thoroughly good time. A sleigh ride had been planned, but the girls would not leave their father. So the guests departed early, and as twilight gathered, the happy family sat together round the fire. Just a year ago, we were groaning over the dismal Christmas we expected to have. Do you remember? Asked Joe, breaking a short pause which had followed a long conversation about many things. Rather a pleasant year on the whole, said Meg, smiling at the fire, and congratulating herself on having treated Mr. Brooke with dignity. I think it's been a pretty hard one, observed Amy, watching the light shine on her ring with thoughtful eyes. I'm glad it's over because we've got you back, whispered Beth, who sat on her father's knee. Rather a rough road for you to travel, my little pilgrims, especially the latter part of it. That means the end of it. But you have got on bravely, and I think the burdens are in a fair way to tumble off very soon, said Mr. March, looking with fatherly satisfaction at the four young faces gathered round him. So, as we keep reading fifth graders, this question about number four, he's going to talk to the girls about what they succeeded in. And so, this does connect to something that came up much earlier in the book. We have to kind of listen and think about what he's talking about. How do you know? Did Mother tell you? Asked Joe. Not much. Straws show which way the wind blows, and I've made several discoveries today. Oh, tell us what they are, cried Meg, who sat beside him. Here is one. And taking up the hand which lay on the arm of his chair, he pointed to the roughened forefinger, a burn on the back, and two or three little hard spots on the palm. I remember a time when this hand was white and smooth, and your first care was to keep it so. It was very pretty then, but to me it is much prettier now. For in these seeming blemishes I read a little history. A burnt offering has been made of vanity. This hardened palm has earned something better than blisters. And I'm sure the sewing done by these pricked fingers will last a long time. So much goodwill went into the stitches. Meg, my dear, I value the womanly skill which keeps home happy more than white hands or fashionable accomplishments. I'm proud to shake this good, industrious little hand, and I hope I shall not soon be asked to give it away. If Meg had wanted a reward for hours of patient labor, she received it in the hearty pressure of her father's hand and the approving smile he gave her. So he's commenting on how Meg has changed and grown in the last year. She's putting the needs of others, the needs of their household before the vanity of her hands. What about Joe? Please say something nice, for she has tried so hard and been so very, very good to me, said Beth in her father's ear. He laughed and looked across at the tall girl who sat opposite, with an unusually mild expression in her brown face. In spite of the curly crop, I don't see the son Joe whom I left a year ago, said Mr. March. I see a young lady who pins her collar straight, laces her boots neatly, and neither whistles, talks slang, nor lies on the rug as she used to do. Her face is rather thin and pale just now, with watching and anxiety. But I like to look at it, for it has grown gentler, and her voice is lower. She doesn't bounce, but moves quietly, and takes care of a certain little person in a motherly way, which delights me. I rather miss my wild girl, but if I get a strong, helpful, tender-hearted woman in her place, I shall feel quite satisfied. I don't know whether the shearing sobered our black sheep, but I do know that in all Washington I couldn't find anything beautiful enough to be bought with the $25 which my good girl sent me. Joe's keen eyes were rather dim for a minute, and her thin face grew rosy in the firelight as she received her father's praise, feeling that she did deserve a portion of it. So we see this observation of Joe in particular, I think this gentleness about her, right? We know that Joe has sort of a fiery temperament and certainly is prone to anger and rash decisions. And here we see that she's shown her father that she's much gentler, she's slower to act, and more kind of calm and quiet. She's controlling some of that urge towards her fiery, angry behavior. Now, Beth, said Amy, longing for her turn, but ready to wait. Even that tells us a little change in Amy. There's so little of her, I'm afraid to say much for fear she will slip away altogether. Though she is not so shy as she used to be, began their father cheerfully. But recollecting how nearly he had lost her, he held her close, saying tenderly, with her cheek against his own, "I've got you safe, my Beth, and I'll keep you so, please God." After a minute's silence, he looked down at Amy, who sat on the cricket at his feet, and said, with a caress of the shining hair, "I observed that Amy took drumsticks at dinner, ran errands for her mother all the afternoon, gave Meg her place tonight, and has waited on everyone with patience and good humor. I also observe that she does not fret much, nor look in the glass, that's the mirror, and has not even mentioned a very pretty ring which she wears. So I conclude that she has learned to think of other people more, and of herself less, and has decided to try and mold her character as carefully as she molds her little clay figures. I am glad of this, for though I should be very proud of a graceful statue made by her, I shall be infinitely prouder of a lovable daughter with a talent for making life beautiful to herself and others." "What are you thinking of, Beth?" asked Joe, when Amy had thanked her father and told about the ring. "I read in Pilgrim's Progress today how after many troubles Christian and Hopeful came to a pleasant green meadow where lilies bloomed all the year round, and there they rested happily, as we do now, before they went on to their journey's end," answered Beth, adding, as she slipped out of her father's arms and went slowly to the instrument, "It's singing time now, and I want to be in my old place. I'll try to sing the song of the shepherd boy which the pilgrims heard. I made the music for father because he likes the verses." So, sitting at the dear little piano, Beth softly touched the keys, and in the sweet voice they had never thought to hear again, sang to her own accompaniment the quaint hymn, which was a singularly fitting song for her. I just read the answer to question 6, fifth graders, and we're going to kind of loop back to 4 and 5 at the end. "He that is down need fear no fall, he that is low no pride. He that is humble ever shall have God to be his guide. I am content with what I have, little be it or much, and Lord contentment still I crave, because thou savest such. Fullness to them a burden is that go on a pilgrimage. Here little and hereafter bliss is best from age to age." Okay, so fifth graders, I've kind of hinted at all of the multiple choice, and so we're thinking about number 4, and it's actually apt that Beth mentions Pilgrim's Progress, because this should kind of bring us back to earlier in the book when they talked about playing pilgrims. So kind of have to think about that. Was one of your very early questions: is what does that mean when they said that they were going to play pilgrims? That's actually our first chapter of the book. Do you remember what they said that they were going to try to do? Remember playing pilgrims, they're kind of like Pilgrim's Progress. They're making this journey to try to get to this sort of beautiful city at the end. And the girls used to make believe that they were doing that. But they decided now that they're older, they're going to play in earnest. And so they talked about picking up their burdens, which we've talked throughout the book now about their burdens, right? That Amy's burden is her conceit and her selfishness, or Joe's burden is her anger, or Beth's burden is her shyness, or Meg's burden is her vanity. And so they were going to pick up their burdens and try to make progress towards this happy ending. And remember, they said that they wanted to get as far as they could before their father came home. And we talked at the beginning of the book about how far and what. We talked about how they wanted to get as far as they could in improving themselves and becoming more virtuous. And so question 4 is really about that. Mr. March is telling the girls that they had succeeded in these endeavors to become more virtuous, to kind of improve in these areas of weakness, these burdens that they carry. Okay, so that really gets at the answer to number 4, and should also very clearly point to number 5, which of these themes is going to relate to that particular topic. Okay, should have a pretty good idea now, 5th graders, of what your answers are to these questions. I'm excited to read your answers and see your vocabulary sentences using that word estimable. As always, if you have questions, let me know.